I've talked a little bit about that this is, extended family, and that this is a bit of a family reunion for some of you. And it's in that spirit that I am introducing our keynote speaker, Carmen Perez, Executive Director for Gathering for Justice and the Justice League New York City. Her bio is in your packet, but I'm just going to read a portion of it and then highlight a piece that resonates with me. So Carmen is something of a Renaissance woman in modern day activism. She has dedicated 20 years to advocating for many of today's important civil rights issues, including mass incarceration, gender equity, violence prevention, racial healing, and community policing. As the executive director of the Gathering for Justice, a nonprofit founded by legendary artist and activist Harry Belafonte, Carmen has crossed the globe promoting peace through civil and human rights, building alternatives to incarceration and violence, and providing commentary and guidance for state and federal policy creation. So as I got to know who Carmen is and her path that has brought her to this point, I learned that she actually worked inside probation, but I loved her frame. She was about systems change from the inside and keeping systems accountable from the inside. That activist spirit embedded within systems is I think, an absolute strength. Working under, I think, at that time, the chief of probation, Judy Cox, who is one of our more progressive and legendary leaders in Santa Cruz County, and has a complete passion and commitment for the health and success of young people. Now I know Carmen has achieved many things in her life, and we've invited her today to spend some time reflecting on that path that has brought her to this point in her life today, and to share some of those reflections and really hopefully touch on the power of engaging young people and their families in the process of change. So we will invite Carmen up to the podium and welcome her today. Thank you, Carmen. This is for you.
Hello. How's everyone doing? Can I ask you all for a huge favor? Yeah? Can I have you guys stand up? Tamaya I think she got the memo because she's putting her hands up. Can I have you guys put your hands up in the air and reach as far as you can and say, I am powerful and I am necessary? I am powerful and I am necessary. Say that again. I am powerful and I am necessary. I am powerful and I am necessary and I am loved. I am powerful and I am necessary and I am loved. Thank you. All right, y'all could have a seat. So I don't really do the traditional keynote addresses, especially when I'm around family. I feel like I'm in a room of sisters, brothers, cousins, mentors, femtors, and uncles and aunts. And it's truly an honor to be here with so many young people. And I just want to say thank you to Julio, and thank you to Matt for making sure I was okay coming, and the California Endowment, the California Wellness, the Sierra Health, and the Zaberback Family Foundation for making today possible, but also all of you who have traveled here, especially because it takes time to be present. And if we are working towards young people, that's one of the qualities we must have in order to be youth advocates, is to be present in this time at this moment, to invest. Because if we don't do that, then we're just like every other person in this young person's life. Real talk. So, it's an incredible time to be here today. I think about why I got involved in organizing with young people, and it was particularly because I grew up 45 minutes from here. Where are we, downtown LA? No, we're not in downtown LA. Where are we? We're in mid-LA. So I grew up in Oxnard. And I grew up in a community that was, I don't want to use the word plagued, but it had a lot of violence and a lot of gangs. My family is 7 generations of gang membership. My father is 93 years old. He was a Pachuco. And I also grew up with a home that had domestic violence. And at the age of 17, the day that I woke up, I remember walking into a church, and when I was walking down the aisle, there was balloons, and there was an open casket, and there was a cake. And when I went up to the casket, it said, "Happy birthday, Carmen and Patricia." We were burying my sister, who would have been turning 19 a day before me. And so I also grew up with a brother in the system. And so at the age of 14, I learned how to bail him out, and my name was Miss Perez. Yes, Miss Perez. I remember transferring money, calling the bail's bondsman, and then taking my parents' car to pick him up outside of the county jail at 2 in the morning. And so I always feel like I know at this moment I choose to do this work, but sometimes this work chooses us based on what we've been through, based on what we have experienced in our lives. But I didn't really know that the work chose me, because I didn't know how to talk about what I had been through. I just knew that I wanted to change the world since I was little. And my sister's death was that catalyst that woke me up. Just like a lot of people got woke after number 45 got elected, right? I got woke at 17. And luckily, I had positive mentors in my life, many people like yourselves that work with young people, that gave me a positive outlet. I grew up playing basketball from the age of 6 all the way to college, softball, ran track. And basketball for me was a way in which I was able to channel my anger, because coming from a home with domestic violence is not the easiest thing to deal with as a child. And oftentimes we want to do what has been done to us, to others. And because I had basketball and somebody in my life, I was able to channel a lot of my pain and take it out on that ball, on Spalding. But many young people don't have those opportunities. And so when my sister passed away, yes, I was mourning for a very long time. I couldn't see my life beyond the next day. I couldn't see my life without her. But I remember that my basketball coach taught me 5 things. There are 5 values every time we huddled. He said, never give up, dedication, determination, family, and confidence. And so when I wanted to give up and I wanted to end my life, I did. I ended my life in Oxnard, and I went to UC Santa Cruz, and I started new. And I was able to harness the relationships that were in my life at the time and make new ones. And so when I went away to Santa Cruz, I didn't study psychology. I didn't study psychology because I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I studied psychology for self-healing. And oftentimes in our communities, we don't necessarily think about the trauma that people are experiencing. And so when we finally see a young person in front of us, it's because they have done something. But what about the trauma that they have experienced all those years? And so in Santa Cruz, I got involved with an organization called YCOR. And YCOR is now CRP. It was Youth Community Restoration Project. And we were used in lieu of young people doing time in the detention center, was to then give young people an opportunity to do community beautification projects. And I was a job developer case manager, right? And so I'm about 22 years old, and I'm working with young people, and I'm supposed to get them a job, right? Well, when young people don't have phones or a place to sleep or don't have access to family support, are they able to get jobs? How am I supposed to allow them to thrive when they don't even have their needs met? And so at that moment, it's probably when I met George and I met Shaka, 2001. I was so determined to work with these young people. But I also was working with folks in the system. I remember getting trained in the strength-based approach, which allowed us to kind of see the strengths of young people and help them flare it out. But we were all trained in it as a community so that we could collaborate and keep our eyes on the prize. The prize was not about who got more funding or who was sitting at the table. The prize was that we were trying to work to ensure that young people had opportunities to thrive. And so what I remember is that at the time when I was working with these youth, I saw a lot of myself in them, but I also knew that they needed more, and that they were the ones that were experts in juvenile justice, that they were experts in their own reality. They knew how it was to walk as a 17-year-old at that time, and I didn't. And so what I did is I used to drag them to meetings with me, not to use them as ornaments, but to actually educate them on the policy process. So if people were gonna be making decisions about their lives, I was gonna make sure that they were there understanding what these decisions were. And so using the power of these young people's voices was probably the best thing that I could have done, because I learned from them. And I remember us sitting on the side in rooms where everybody had their degrees on their shoulders, using big words, right? Like, let's reduce racial disparities and recidivism, and the young people are like, well, what is that? How many of you guys been there? Or you've been in rooms like that, right? How many of us have done that sometimes? Yeah, I know, I'm guilty of that as well. But so the beautiful thing about it is that I was working with these young people that had been addicted to meth, heroin, that were involved in gangs, but they were sitting in spaces where they could also be part of the decision making and can actually talk about what worked for them. And so oftentimes when we were looking at drug and alcohol reform, people were talking about, well, let's just send them to AA. When the young people were saying, there's more to that. There are challenges that I face every single day to be sober. And out of that came the 7 Challenges curriculum. And my role during that time was also to organize myself out of that role, not to be stagnant in a position that was really meant for youth. Even though at 22, I would want to believe I was a young person, but according to 17-year-olds, you're old, right? So, at a certain point in my life, I then went to go work for Barrios Unidos under the mentorship of Nane Alejandres, who taught me the importance of cultural organizing. And sometimes we talk about organizing and then we forget the cultural piece, right? But we are cultured people. So we do that every single day. What strips us of our culture are the institutions like higher learning or education and the juvenile justice system. So I know many of you here are formerly incarcerated, and I also want to honor the expertise in this room because I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. But there's a lot of you who know these things and who do these things every single day and know the importance to have those that are most impacted by the issue at the center and talking and making decisions about it. But I think about when I became a probation officer, and this is after me organizing in prisons with Nane, cultural and spiritual ceremonies, and being really solid in who I was. I remember going to powwows and singing and being connected to my indigenous culture, knowing who I was, being able to stand in front of people and say and own who I was. And there are so many times that we're not able to do that because you have to either have the executive director role or I'm the Women's March role, but I feel I'm all of that. I'm all those things. I'm a woman, I'm Chicana, I'm from Oxnard, I live in New York City, I grew up in the hood. I'm a victim of domestic violence. I am the daughter of an immigrant mother. I am the sister of an formerly incarcerated person. And I am the sister of somebody whose life was taken at a very young age. I'm all of that. But when you enter the system, you are stripped down. They take away your clothes. They don't let you speak to your family. Right? That's what they do. Why is that? Because they try to take your dignity away. Right? And so what I always talk about is the fact that we need to infuse these systems with culture, not because I feel that systems work for our young people, but we need to create transformative systems where people like you are actually sitting at the table making decisions about how those systems are running. Young people are at the table talking about youth programming, what works and what doesn't work. But we all have to sit at the table. And I know at this particular moment in California, there's a lot of collaborations that are happening. Collaborations that were not happening 15, 17 years ago. We weren't sitting at the table with probation. We weren't sitting at the table with mental health or the Department of Education. And now it just seems like that's the way in which we have to build collective power, right? And so one of the things that I feel is also missing sometimes from the narrative is gender responsive programming for young women. I became a probation officer because I had to help create the Girls Task Force. And that was to provide gender responsive programming for girls regardless of probation status. And I never thought I'd be a probation officer. I didn't really meet the criteria at the time when they said, do you know anybody who's a felon? And I was like, well, no, but I have family members, right? So I didn't anticipate being, Shaka will tell you, I was like revolutionary since day one I met him. I was like, no, we're gonna shut it down, right? If we don't get it, shut it down, right? But there was something that I was reminded of when I remember seeing my brother in and out the system for 40 years. 40 years. My brother's 54 years old, and he's been in and out the system for 40 years. And I had always said, man, if somebody just cared about him, if somebody cared about his family, if somebody gave us the tools to deal with him, because we didn't know how to deal with him. My mom would kick him out. My mom would be angry at him. And it wasn't until I learned the strength-based approach, I said, Mom, you can't kick him out. You can't do that. We gotta give him love. We gotta support him. But we didn't have the support. We didn't know how to deal with him. And we don't even know how to deal with our young girls. The system is not set up for young women. We shackle women when they're giving birth. We don't give them their basic needs in the detention center, and we re-traumatize them every single time we have to test them. Right? Because what do you have to do? You have to watch them what? Urinate in a cup. What does that do to a woman, which we know girls, 8 out of 10 have been sexually abused? What does that do to them? But we're not talking about it. We're not investing in young women. So we need to reevaluate some of the work that we're doing. And I know the Center for Young Women's Development, that's now called, is here. I used to know Marlene. I used to roll with her back in the day. And so it was the Center for Young Women's Development. But so again, it's important. So for me, being a youth advocate, or actually somebody who was personally impacted, not personally, but my family impacted by the issue, going into systems, going into community organizing, has led me to where I am now. Being intentional about the communities that I work in, making sure that we use cultural and spiritual ceremony as a way to deal with the trauma that we don't necessarily talk about. to actually deal with individuals and see them and meet them where they're at. But also understand that as we're dealing with our own communities and the most marginalized, we got to deal with those that are also marginalizing our communities. So we have to meet them where they're at, like Mr. Belafonte, my mentor says, and champion them to our cause. And so that's the reason why I went into the probation department, because I wanted to learn how to speak their language. I wanted to make sure that I opened the door so that communities could also be a part of the conversation. And as a result of that, we were able to get an evening center in Santa Cruz County, in Santa Cruz Barrios Unidos. Nane was sitting at the table around DMC. The Burns Institute had come in to do racial disparities, reducing racial disparities, DMC work inside the detention center, and I was able to be that bridge because I knew how to talk to community. I came from community. I came from impacted communities, and I was also able to talk the systems language. And so it's important that we make sure, and there's a lot of lessons learned. One, people call you a sellout for going into the system. Right? For those folks that actually work with systems, people from community will call you a sellout. Two, you're trying to navigate multiple worlds. You're trying to navigate the systems world where people don't necessarily understand community, and then you're trying to navigate the community world where sometimes the language is all that separates us. But the reason why people went into this work seems to be kind of similar. And also the fact that I think some of the things that were challenging working in these different spaces was the fact that it always seemed like I was the only one navigating these spaces. And I should have advocated for more people to be a part of it. But the beautiful thing about it is the fact that I was able to make systems change in the time that I was there. I was able to ensure that girls were not being re-traumatized because no longer were they being tested through invasive testing, but non-invasive testing. Laura knows that. She was a part of that as well. And so we used oral swabs instead. And girls were able to receive training on how to be public speakers, but also running Girl Circle curriculum, giving them the opportunity to know the difference between dating violence, domestic violence, talk about their bodies, know what healthy bodies were, know what healthy relationships were. And that was because I knew that it was important that I sit at that table to ensure that girls got those opportunities. And it's not always easy, so there's sacrifices that we have to make, right? And so, how can we hold the system accountable? Yeah. So, you said meetings, town halls. You said tearing it down. Make it personal to their life. What else? Petitions, collaborations, all of those things. And I know for us, when we're working with some of the detention staff and the probation officers, is that they didn't even know they could make an impact on racial disparity. So they weren't aware. So what I always say is education is number one. We need to bring public awareness to the issues that impact us. We need to have the one-on-one conversations, right? Key to organizing is what? Doing one-on-ones. How many of you guys have one-on-ones? Right? Having those one-on-ones with people before you bring them to a coalition, because you want to make sure that people know what they're actually there for. How many times have you showed up to a meeting and you're like, what is this about? Right? How many guys do that? Yeah, exactly. So part of what part of what I feel was really helpful during that time was the fact that we were having one-on-ones with people. We were actually surveying people to see where their knowledge was. What was it that they knew about system accountability? Did they even know it existed? Did they even know they could personally make an impact? And half the time, the people that we surveyed talked about they wanted to go into the system to help people, but ended up getting caught up in the system, right? And so also, they didn't know that they can actually make an impact when it came to the youth. And not to say that we need to let people scot-free, I'm just giving you some information based on my findings. And so the first thing was educating them, giving them the resources and the tools that they needed in order to ensure that a young person didn't slip through the cracks. But we have to do better. We have to do better. When I was a probation officer and one of my young people would get caught up by the police officer, I would risk the young person in my head. The risk assessment instrument was in my head. So when the police officer would call me and say, hey, Ms. Perez, we have such and such here, this is what she did, and we're transporting her right now to the detention center. And I said, hold up. And so I would risk the young people, and I said, she doesn't risk high enough to be detained. And the police officer would say, well, I still need to take her. And I would call my colleague, my partner, and say, could you please transport this person? Do not book them. Do not book them. And that's all it took for me. But it's because I cared, because I knew the impact that I could make on this young person, where other people, they're just asleep on it. And then also when it comes to not only systems, but when we talk about youth organizing, I find it fascinating how not many young people are part of the youth organizing. I just turned 40, and I feel really great about that. But I am not a youth. I've been in this field for 20 plus years, and I know at that time, I was a youth ally, an adult ally. But I certainly am not a young person. And so what we also need to do a little better, and I know I need to do it better, so I'm just calling myself out, is we need to bring young people into the fold and give them access and let them speak. Let them be the keynote speakers next time. And I'm sure we could arrange that, right? Because I want to hear from you all. We always talk about that young people are the future. Are they really the future? They're actually the present and are the greatest gift we have at this moment. And so what I want to leave you with is what led me to this time right now has been everything that I have been through and all the people that have come into my life, from the people who were naysayers to the people who encouraged me to continue, from the time that I spent at probation, calling my mentor during lunch when I had a 9-year-old come into my office. All of that prepared me to be the national co-chair of the Women's March on Washington and bring out close to 5 million people. And I'm going to tell you why. Because I needed to organize across the country, and I needed people to challenge me, and I needed to sleep on floors with community. I needed to be homeless. I needed to actually understand what it was to go through all that, to give me the responsibility to make sure that when we organize, the most impacted communities are at the center. When we create policy, we include those that are impacted, not only as it pertains to race or issues, but also gender and gender nonconforming and trans people. We still have a system that doesn't recognize that young people at this moment are gender nonconforming. We have a system that still doesn't serve our girls. We have a system that still doesn't recognize that there are trans people that are constantly being victimized. Why? Because we have our egos present. Because we have our own cultural values present. Maybe it ain't for us, but that doesn't mean it ain't for them. Just because something doesn't work for us doesn't mean it doesn't work for them. And that's why we got to make sure that those voices are sitting here too. That those young people can educate us. That those experts, right? Like the James Bell, James Bell, do you guys know? Yeah, everybody knows who James Bell is. James Bell, I was probably 22 years old when I first heard him speak. And he had said something, young people enter the system because they pissed off an adult. Yeah. And that stuck with me forever. Because when I was looking at how young people were entering the system, it was because they pissed off their mom, their dad, their teacher, some adult. Right? That's how young people enter the system. When we break up the data, where are they coming from? Schools. No? Are they coming from schools? Where are young people coming from? They get funneled, right? The school to prison pipeline. But again, all these different things allow us to create a system that centers around young people and them actually thriving. When young people are sitting at the table, when trans young people are sitting at the table, when culture is included, when spirituality, when healing, when systems folks, because we also need to talk to the system folks, right? And I know many of you partner with them. But we need to use a comprehensive and holistic approach. And I didn't learn that from studying or doing a training. I learned that from watching Nane. Going into prisons and talking to the men and tugging at their heart and telling their story and allowing people to share who they were, how they came to be, because everybody in here has a story. And so what are we going to do? What are we going to do when we leave here? Go back to your city. And what you going to do? Take action. But also know that all of you are making such a powerful difference. All of you are loved and necessary. All of you are powerful. All of you are already doing things that we had never seen before. I always brag about California and New York. I live in New York City right now, and New York State and North Carolina are the two states that automatically prosecute 16-year-olds as adults. And I've been fighting for the past 6 years to raise the age of criminal responsibility. Not just to get young people out the adult system, but to raise it right. Because the governor compromises our young people by saying, yes, we'll release them this year, we'll put it in the budget, but you know what? It'll take 10 years to expunge their records. 10 years when a young person doesn't even belong in an adult facility, like a Khalif Browder. Khalif allegedly stole a backpack. And was in Rikers for 3 years. While he was in Rikers, he did 2 years of solitary confinement for allegedly stealing a backpack. That's what the system does to us. And so as advocates, it's not just about marching. It's also about organizing, educating, training, changing policy, and putting political pressure on the ground. And so that's what we've been fighting every single day. 2 a.m, we have a rapid response team. My phone blows up every single minute. And if you guys don't have a rapid response team, I would love to help you create one. because that's the way in which we organize in Justice League New York City, is that we have policymakers, we have film directors, we have hip hop artists, we have formerly incarcerated people, we have victims, we have all these people that come together and build collective power. Because if my boy, Immortal Technique, and my song could get on Hot 97 and talk about raise the age, they're reaching a whole different audience than I don't have. If my boy Ramin could put together a teaser about Khalif Browder or young people being sentenced or a meme and we could post it, something that I don't have. So we need everybody, because there's a lane for all of you. There's a lane for everybody to get involved in this movement of juvenile justice reform, juvenile justice transformation. That's how we win. We're not here in competition with one another. Foundations, I urge you to please continue to strengthen these organizations by funding them. There are people in this room who've been doing work for decades. And we haven't really been able to win sometimes is because we don't have the financial resources. I know I didn't get paid at Barrios Unidos. I don't know if anybody else did, but I didn't get paid. But my heart was too committed to making sure that we got to free our young people. And so it's important to collaborate with one another and also build collective power. And it's how we're gonna win. It's how we are gonna win. Thank you.